You've probably seen videos claiming that a puffy face and rounded jawline are signs of high cortisol. Let's find out if that's actually true and what to do if it is. Hello and welcome to The Midwife Says. My name is Melanie and I am almost a licensed midwife in the state of Florida. Here I share evidence-based facts about women's health, pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. So TikTok and Instagram have been talking a lot lately about cortisol face. The idea that puffiness around the face, around a jawline, or a buffalo hump at the back of the neck are visible signs of chronically elevated cortisol from stress. It's a compelling idea, but is it actually true? Is your face telling you something about your stress hormones? And even if the trend is oversimplified, is there real science worth paying attention to here? Let's break it down. We're doing a what to do here, taking a trend claim and running it through the evidence. So what is cortisol and what does it actually do? Cortisol is a glucocorticoid hormone produced by the adrenal glands. It regulates blood sugar, metabolism, inflammation, and the stress response. It follows a diurnal rhythm, peaks in the morning, declines through the day. In pathologically high cortisol states, specifically Cushing's syndrome or Cushing's disease, where cortisol is dramatically and chronically elevated due to tumor or disease, you do see very specific physical changes. Central adiposity, so weight gain around the midsection, a rounded face, also known as a moon face, a buffalo hump at the back of the neck, purple stretch marks, skin thinning. These are real clinical findings documented in endocrinology literature. Cushing syndrome is real, but it's also rare. The question is, does the everyday chronic stress most of us live with produce the same effects? So I actually had no idea what this whole cortisol face thing was about. And it was a patient who asked me about this in clinic one day. And she said, I noticed that my face is very puffy. Do you think that I have cortisol face? And I was like, what? I've never heard of this before. What do you mean cortisol face? Tell me about this. And so we had this super insightful conversation, and me being a lover of science and evidence, I went home and researched it absolutely into the ground. So here's what I found. What the research actually says about chronic stress and body composition. The chronic everyday stress most people experience does not produce Cushing level cortisol elevations. But research by Dr. Elisa Epel and others at UCSF has shown that psychological stress is associated with increased visceral fat deposition, fat around the organs, through cortisol's effects on adipose tissue distribution. The stress-fat connection is real, it's just more nuanced than stress gives you a puffy face overnight. But here's where the trend gets interesting. Cortisol promotes water and sodium retention. Even moderate elevations in cortisol from poor sleep, chronic stress, or overexercising can contribute to puffiness and facial bloating through inflammation and fluid retention. This isn't a myth, but it's much more complex than the trend implies. When I heard about this, I was looking at old photos of myself from the times in my life that were particularly stressful after I had my babies, during the really tough points of midwifery school, and I was like, oh my gosh, I actually have a cortisol phase. And I remember that when I got through the really tough part of midwifery school and finally had more time to dedicate to myself and my health, there were some things that I did that really helped. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit later. But what I want to also discuss that nobody talks about is hypocortisolism, the burnout side. Here's something the trend completely misses. In many chronically stressed people, especially those who have been running on high stress for a long time, the pattern isn't high cortisol, it's actually low cortisol. The HPA axis essentially gets burnt out. Research by Fries in Psychoneuroendocrinology describes a pattern called hypocortisolism, where the system downregulates after prolonged activation. This is associated with burnout, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and PTSD. Ironically, some of the same symptoms get attributed to cortisol face, regardless of whether cortisol is high or low. This is exactly why self-diagnosing from a trend is limited. The solution, if you actually want to understand your cortisol pattern, is testing. The Dutch test, which stands for Dried Urine Test for Comprehensive Hormones, gives you a cortisol curve across the day and shows both free and metabolized cortisol. I'll link information for where to find the Dutch test below. This is a functional medicine hormone test that gives a much more complete picture than a single blood draw. I want to make a note that I really love functional medicine testing and testing that follows that modality. While I have not personally ever done the Dutch test, I know people that have, and functional testing in general is much more comprehensive, and the ranges of normal are much more narrowed in. So what can you actually do? Let's say you do the Dutch test. You say you do all of your digging. What can we do? Whether or not the viral trend is perfectly accurate, the underlying conversation that chronic stress has real physical consequences and that we should take the HPA axis regulation seriously is valid and important. So here is some evidence-based support for cortisol regulation. Number 1, consistent sleep schedules. Wake and sleep at the same time. Number 2, morning sunlight exposure. Number 3, adequate dietary protein to support cortisol metabolism. Number 3, stress management practices with actual evidence, things like yoga, breathwork, nature exposure, and social connection. And lastly, targeted supplementation. Supplements that have the most clinical research behind them is ashwagandha in the KSM-66 form. This has robust clinical research for cortisol regulation, and I'll link a trusted brand below. And magnesium glycinate, which I mention in almost every single video because it really is that useful for sleep, cortisol rhythm, and nervous system regulation. I'll link that below as well. So, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, looking back at these pictures of myself of the stressful times in my life, I noticed that I really did have a cortisol face. And when I started having more time for myself after midwifery school, I started incorporating some of these supplements, getting out in the morning and taking a walk, making sure that I did my daily exercise every day and had time to recover from that. And it made the biggest difference. So the cortisol face trend is really getting at something real, that our stress physiology affects our physical bodies in visible and invisible ways. The nuance just matters. Your face puffiness has a lot of potential causes, and chronic stress is one of them, but it's worth understanding the full picture. If this gave you something useful, please share it and drop in the comments. Have you felt like stress affected your physical body? What's been your experience and what helped you? I would love if you would subscribe, and thank you so much for spending your precious time with me today. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.